To understand the Vikings' military dominance, one must begin not on the battlefield, but in the longhouses and rugged coastal villages of the north. Unlike many cultures that conscript soldiers as needed, the Viking society was fundamentally built upon the glorification of war. Every male child born into a Viking family was immersed in an environment that celebrated valor, conquest, and death in battle as the ultimate honor. From the age of 5 or 6, young boys were introduced to the art of war not through lectures, but through practice. Wooden swords and shields were placed in their hands before they could fully comprehend language. They sparred under the watchful eyes of elder warriors, and stories of great raids and fearless berserkers were sung by the hearth each night. This early exposure to violence and hardship forged a generation of natural fighters. Unlike professional soldiers from other civilizations who were trained as adults, Vikings grew up inside the rhythm of conflict. Hunting, wrestling, weapon crafting, sailing, every activity contributed to the making of a hardened combatant. Pain was considered a form of education, and fear a weakness to be broken early. Death, far from being feared, was welcomed if it came on the battlefield. This mindset created warriors who did not waver under threat, who charged into battle not just for plunder, but for glory and spiritual fulfillment. Moreover, their society was devoid of excessive hierarchy. A poor farmer could rise to prominence by sheer skill and bravery, further incentivizing ferocity. There was no concept of waiting in ranks for orders. Vikings valued initiative and the ability to adapt in chaos. This decentralized and fearless culture bred not just soldiers, but warriors, individuals who could think, fight, and survive in the most brutal conditions. While many depictions of Vikings rely on the romantic image of horned helmets and wild, unorganized rampages, the truth of their battlefield success lies in a much more complex combination of equipment, tactical understanding, and battlefield flexibility. The tools of war the Vikings used were neither primitive nor accidental. They were refined through generations of warcraft and blacksmithing mastery. Their weapons, be it the seeks, short sword, the axe, the spear, or the legendary Ulfbert swords, were forged from superior quality steel. Many of their blades outmatched those of continental Europe, both in terms of sharpness and durability. The Ulfbert, in particular, bore inscriptions and was produced using crucible steel, centuries ahead of its time. This technological leap gave them a cutting edge, literally, in close combat. Their shields were round, light enough for agile movement but strong enough to deflect blows. Vikings used these shields not just for defense but also as offensive tools. In formations like the shield wall, their coordination rivaled that of the best-trained Roman legions. When locked together, the shields created a barrier that was nearly impenetrable. Behind it, spears would thrust, axes would swing, and arrows would be caught or deflected. Tactically, Vikings were anything but predictable. They attacked at dawn or during storms, from riverbanks or hidden coves. Their use of longships enabled amphibious assaults with no warning. Villages that had never seen an army before found themselves surrounded by screaming warriors who had already mapped out the terrain from previous scouting trips. The Vikings studied their enemies, took prisoners not just for ransom but for intelligence, and adapted their methods for each campaign. Where brute force failed, they used cunning. Where confrontation was too risky, they relied on ambushes. Their raids often had surgical precision, minimizing wasted time and maximizing destruction. One of the most decisive factors in Viking supremacy was their unparalleled command of the sea. Their longships were the envy of the known world, not merely because of their craftsmanship, but because of what they allowed the Vikings to do. Built with overlapping planks and reinforced with strong but flexible timber, these ships were fast, agile, and capable of traversing both open oceans and shallow rivers. This meant that Vikings could strike almost anywhere, from fortified coastal cities to remote inland monasteries. Unlike conventional armies that relied on roads and supply lines, Viking forces could bypass traditional defenses by sailing upriver, landing behind enemy lines, and disappearing before any organized resistance could form. Their mobility rendered static defenses obsolete. Castles and walls meant little if the enemy could simply arrive by sea and attack where the wall ended. Even when facing superior numbers, the Vikings could retreat to their ships, vanish into the fjords, and strike again elsewhere the following day. But their naval mastery wasn't just technical, it was also strategic. Viking leaders used weather patterns, tidal movements, and even seasonal migrations to time their attacks. They preferred to raid during spring and summer, when seas were calmer and crops were ripe for taking. The raid served multiple functions: to gather resources, to scout new territories, and to create fear-based psychological control. Communities struck by Vikings rarely recovered quickly. Survivors would flee, infrastructure would collapse, and the fear of a return would often prevent reoccupation. In addition, the longships carried more than warriors, they carried settlers. After raids, the Vikings would often establish winter camps, fortify them, and return in the spring to expand. This meant their presence could go from transient to permanent within a single year. Their ships, therefore, were not just tools of war, but instruments of empire building. The Viking presence on the battlefield was not just physical, it was psychological. Before their axes were raised or their ships appeared on the horizon, their reputation arrived first. Entire communities would tremble at the mere rumor of Viking sails. This fear was not accidental, it was cultivated, sharpened, and wielded like another weapon in their vast arsenal. Vikings understood the value of psychological warfare long before the term existed. They meticulously crafted an image of themselves as bloodthirsty, unstoppable berserkers, men who laughed at pain, who welcomed death, and who fought under the watch of gods that demanded glory. Tales of their ruthlessness spread rapidly across Europe. Monasteries were burned, priests were slaughtered, and nobles were humiliated, sometimes flayed, sometimes dragged through the streets. The Vikings often spared a few survivors for the specific purpose of spreading their legend further, letting their enemies do the work of intimidation for them. The use of berserkers, warriors believed to fight in a trance-like fury, amplified this fear. Whether drug-induced or ritualistic, these fighters were known to throw themselves into battle without armor, howling like beasts, impervious to wounds until death itself stopped them. They shattered enemy morale not by sheer numbers, but by breaking the will to resist. Even well-disciplined forces struggled to maintain formation in the face of such primal aggression. Fear, when properly deployed, breaks lines before they are tested. Villages offered tribute rather than resistance. Cities opened their gates instead of facing destruction. In many cases, the Vikings won before the first spear was thrown, because the mind of their enemy had already collapsed. It was not just about who had the better sword, but who controlled the narrative. And the Viking narrative was one of unstoppable doom. Another major pillar of Viking military success was the fierce bond between warriors and their chieftains. Viking society may have allowed for individual heroism, but it also fostered a deep sense of brotherhood, especially among those who fought together in battle. These bonds, forged through shared hardship and ritual, made Viking warbands more than just loose groups of raiders. They were tightly knit units that trusted each other with their lives. Leadership in Viking warbands was not inherited through bloodline alone, it was earned through merit, charisma, and courage. A jarl or war chief was expected to fight alongside his men, bleed with them, and die with them if necessary. This earned loyalty that could not be commanded, it had to be inspired. When a leader charged into battle, his warriors followed not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in his strength, his vision, and his ability to lead them to victory. Decision-making in Viking forces was often surprisingly democratic. Major raids were planned through assemblies where free men had the right to voice opinions. While final authority lay with the chieftain, the involvement of the crew fostered unity. Every man felt ownership of the mission, and this collective commitment reduced the chances of mutiny, desertion, or breakdowns in battle. This cohesion extended into their battle tactics. While Vikings could be ferocious, they were not reckless. Shield walls required coordination, timing, and trust. Every man had to know that the warrior beside him would hold his ground. Loyalty was not just a virtue, it was a functional requirement for survival and success. And when a Viking fell in battle, he was not mourned in shame, but honored in song. His death fed the morale of the living. The promise of Valhalla, of feasting forever in the halls of the gods, transformed fear of death into a badge of courage. In such a culture, running from battle was more terrifying than dying in it. Despite their fearsome image, the Vikings were not blind berserkers smashing their way through Europe without reflection. In fact, one of their greatest strengths was their capacity to learn from the very civilizations they were pillaging. The Viking mind was as sharp as the Viking blade, constantly absorbing, adapting, and evolving in response to new challenges. Whenever the Vikings encountered a superior technology or method of warfare, they did not reject it out of pride, they adopted it. They captured smiths and craftsmen, learning advanced forging techniques. They studied fortifications and adapted siege tactics. They learned languages, understood local politics, and even negotiated treaties when it suited them. Over time, their raids evolved into sustained campaigns, then settlements, and finally full-fledged kingdoms in foreign lands. They embraced horseback riding from Slavic and Frankish warriors, expanded their naval repertoire by copying certain Mediterranean techniques, and incorporated new armor styles when it increased survival. The image of the Viking as a static barbarian is a myth. They were relentless innovators when it came to staying alive and winning wars. Moreover, their understanding of geopolitics grew rapidly. Viking leaders realized that not all victories came from brute force. They used diplomacy to pit kingdoms against each other, selling their services as mercenaries or marrying into nobility. In places like Normandy and the British Isles, Vikings didn't just raid, they transformed into rulers. They switched axes for crowns without compromising their warrior spirit. Their ability to pivot, on and off the battlefield, meant that enemies could not rely on past tactics to defeat them. Every Viking return brought new tricks, new formations, new deceptions. The Vikings learned, adapted, and always came back sharper. While the early image of Viking warfare revolves around spontaneous raids and opportunistic looting, the reality was far more calculated. The Vikings had an exceptional ability to think strategically, often planning their campaigns with long-term objectives in mind, be it territorial control, economic dominance, or political leverage. They understood geography as few others did. Their navigational skills allowed them to strike deep inland through rivers while avoiding natural bottlenecks or fortified choke points. Their knowledge of weather patterns and seasonal cycles let them time their attacks perfectly. Summer campaigns were followed by winter consolidations. Settlements were established not merely as homes, but as logistical hubs and staging points for future operations. Unlike many of their enemies, who were constrained by rigid feudal systems or slow communication, the Vikings remained highly mobile and fluid. They could retreat and regroup with ease, often disappearing into the seas only to return elsewhere, days or weeks later. This unpredictability gave them a significant psychological and tactical edge. They also displayed strategic patience. While raids were quick and fierce, their conquests unfolded gradually. The Danelaw in England, the Norse expansion in Ireland, and the settlement of Normandy were not won overnight. These required the cultivation of local alliances, the management of rival Viking factions, and the establishment of sustainable economic structures. They understood the difference between a raid and a regime. In war, the ability to think beyond the battlefield is what separates conquerors from opportunists. The Vikings proved that they could be both when needed, and strategic masterminds when it truly counted. At the heart of Viking dominance was their unparalleled maritime supremacy. Their ships were not just vessels of transport but instruments of power, innovation, and terror. The longship remains one of the most iconic and revolutionary inventions in military history, a masterpiece of engineering that gave the Vikings mobility unmatched by any contemporary force. Longships were sleek, symmetrical, and shallow-drafted. This meant they could sail across open seas at high speed, yet also navigate narrow rivers and shallow estuaries that were impassable to other fleets. They could be hauled over land when necessary, granting them access to inland areas where resistance was minimal or unprepared. No coastline, riverbank, or lakeside town was truly safe from the reach of a Viking warband. But these ships were not merely tools of mobility, they were force multipliers. A fleet of longships could transport hundreds of warriors, horses, and supplies with alarming efficiency. They enabled multi-pronged attacks, coordinated flanking maneuvers, and rapid withdrawals if a campaign turned unfavorable. The Vikings turned naval raids into an art form. They struck where enemy defenses were weakest, often choosing times of religious festivals or political transition. Coastal monasteries and trade hubs were particularly vulnerable, and Viking ships could appear and vanish before a counterattack could even be organized. Their mastery of the seas also enabled economic power. Control of trade routes, harbors, and river mouths allowed them to tax commerce, extract tribute, or simply dominate entire regions without prolonged warfare. In effect, their maritime power turned them into naval empires, fluid, fast-moving, and brutally efficient. No other group during their time period commanded the seas with such ruthlessness and precision. It wasn't just about how they fought, but where, when, and with what speed. And the answer always came back to the longship. Viking warriors were driven not merely by conquest, wealth, or survival, but by cosmic purpose. Their belief system shaped their identity as fighters, lending a spiritual invincibility that elevated their courage beyond reason. They believed in a warrior destiny, where battle was sacred and death, if met with honor, was a passage to eternal glory in Valhalla. This mythology was not abstract, it was embedded in their rituals, their songs, their oaths, and their very names. To die in battle was not a failure but a triumph. To avoid battle was not caution but cowardice. This belief system created fighters who were psychologically fortified against fear, especially the fear of death that undermines many armies in critical moments. Vikings called upon the favor of gods like Odin, the All-Father who hung himself for wisdom, and Thor, the thunder god who smashed giants. These deities were not distant, they were present, invoked in war cries, carved into weapons, and offered blood sacrifices before raids. Their spirituality was visceral, intimate, and ever-present in conflict. The power of belief gave Viking warriors resilience in the face of wounds, hunger, and overwhelming odds. It also gave them a moral simplicity. Victory was not just allowed, it was expected by the gods. Defeat, if it came, had no shame as long as one died fighting. This stripped war of hesitation and infused it with spiritual fervor. Religion also unified Viking communities. Seasonal festivals, sacred groves, and communal rituals built cohesion. A warband was not just a collection of fighters, it was a brotherhood bound by shared cosmology. Such unity magnified their battlefield effectiveness and ensured loyalty even when campaigns dragged on for years. Where other soldiers broke under pressure, the Vikings charged forward, because to them, the battlefield was holy ground, and every swing of the sword was a prayer. Though the Viking Age eventually came to a close, their influence did not. Their legacy was not just carved into the skulls of their enemies or the gold taken from foreign temples, it was woven into the political, cultural, and military fabric of Europe and beyond. Vikings founded cities like Dublin, and redefined regions, such as Normandy, named for the Northmen who settled there. They left behind descendants who would become kings, dukes, and emperors, none more famous than William the Conqueror, a Norman of Viking heritage who reshaped English history in 1066. Their tactics, shipbuilding techniques, and governance systems influenced the rise of feudal states, coastal defenses, and naval empires. They demonstrated the power of mobility in warfare, the impact of psychological dominance, and the importance of adaptability. Long before the age of professional armies or standing navies, the Vikings showed what could be accomplished by warrior societies driven by belief, bonded by blood, and unafraid of death. Even in the lands they didn't conquer permanently, the Vikings altered the rhythm of life. Kingdoms fortified their towns, reorganized militias, and rethought how they responded to external threats, all in reaction to the Viking menace. In many ways, the modern concept of national defense emerged because the Vikings forced it into being. Today, the Viking name still carries weight, symbolizing ferocity, exploration, and warrior spirit. But behind the myth lies a profound truth: the Vikings did not win through brute force alone. They combined fear and faith, strategy and seamanship, brotherhood and brutality into a war machine unlike any the world had seen. That is why they conquered. That is why they endured. That is why their shadow still stretches across history.